I think we'll go ahead and get started. Looks like most of our attendees are here. We've got a global audience again. Very happy to see our North American audience and thankful that the folks in Europe stayed up to listen in, and some folks in our Asia Pac region got up early. So we're delighted to have you all here. Today's webinar is Top 10 Best Practices for Privileged Identity Management. And I'm going to be doing the webinar today. My name is Patrick McBride, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing here at Xceedium. So again, very, very excited to have you. We'll spend some time in the webinar, and I'll save some time at the end for questions, so if you want to jot those down. And also, as you go through, I mean, we're going to offer up some best practices. If there are some observations that you would like to, me to make on your behalf for the audience, other kinds of things, please feel free to type that observation into the question box, and we'll try to relay that to the audience as well. So we're not a full participation, bi-directional audio here, but would love to get your feedback on some other best practices that have worked in your environment. So we'll hopefully save some time or get some good comments on that regard. You can type those questions into the question box, and as I said, we'll take them at the end, and we'll take the comments at the end. So without further ado, let's get going. What we did today was break this the webinar down into a couple of sections. First some baselining, make sure that we're basically all on the same page with the topic, and talk a little bit about how the risks that we'll discuss are changing with some new environments. And then we'll go through our top 10 list here and give you a very brief introduction to Xceedium X Suite, our next generation privileged identity management platform. And take some questions at the end, and hopefully some very good comments and observations from our audience here today. So we're going to start with, who are privileged users, and frankly, why should you care? And both a good and bad thing happened to us recently in terms of the vendors playing in the space, or the customers who are working and understand this threat already and are trying to translate it to other folks, whether it's folks within their organization and their hierarchy, or even folks that they talk to. If everybody everybody is probably recognizes this picture now. The new poster child for the need for watching out for privileged users or insider threat is Snowden, with regard to the NSA incident. And he fits all the hallmarks. He was an insider. He, in fact, was an insider who was also a contractor as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the scenarios in that regard. About a bunch of years ago, the WikiLeaks thing happened, and that wasn't exactly the perfect poster child. That certainly was an insider, but he wasn't necessarily, he was certainly highly privileged. He was an end user who had access to lots of very important information, but he was not a sysadmin who tends to have the keys to the kingdom, as it were. In this case, Snowden did, and clearly had access to things that he shouldn't have had access to. So with the Snowden breach, it was kind of interesting. Fairly shortly after NSA came out and said that one of the things that they were going to implement in a more specific way was the two-man rule. And they and other agencies like them here and abroad already use this rule. As people walk down the hallways or admitted into these organizations, very often they have to go hand in hand with somebody. They're not allowed to go into certain rooms, or if they are, a certain light comes on and lets you know that there's a visitor, and everybody packs everything away on their desk, etc. So if it's it's a visitor without the appropriate credentials, they don't get a chance to see anything. I thought two-man rule might have been a little sexist, so we added two-woman version to the picture. But that said, that is a interesting best practice, and it's something they use in their kind of physical environment and have talked about using in their network environment. That is not a best practice that's going to work for all of us. I think everybody can do the calculations themselves. If you've got a systems administrator or network or database administrator that's involved in malicious activity, and the idea of putting a second person to watch over their shoulder all the time whether that's literally watching over their shoulder, as the picture shows, or figuratively watching over their shoulder, watching a session at the same time. You end up having to hire really smart people. This is not a $10 an hour minimum wage job where somebody can just watch what somebody's doing. These are technical people who use all kinds of tools, and if you don't have the appropriate expertise, you're clearly not going to be able to understand what that person's doing. So you really can't hire 2 for 1 in the sysadmin ranks to make sure that you've got one watching the other at all times. It just doesn't work that way. And so obviously that's a best practice that is right for some folks, and not exactly the way to go for most of our customers. So we'll talk a little bit more about what those practices are that we see the customers actually implementing. So we thought we'd start right away with a little bit of a baseline here, and wanted to start off when we start talking about privileged users. That's one of those subjects that ends up being in the eye of the beholder. A privileged user to one person is not a privileged user to others, or some folks in that category are not. So we thought we'd just put it down here and let you know the kinds of folks that we're typically seeing our customers talk about when they talk about privileged users. It's not the only definition, by the way, and I'll expand on that in a second. So privileged users can be employees, they can be partners, like contractors, consultants, managed services providers, etc. And they tend to be the folks that have the most rights on the network. So they're systems network, database administrators, or even application administrators, folks that are responsible for doling out privileges within a particular application, for example. And as the diagram shows, those folks can, work on-premise, within the confines of your organization on your network directly, or those employees may be working from home or Starbucks or some other place. I was recently camping and was surprised to find that the campsite had wireless access, which seems to be at odds with what you want to do camping, but it was interesting nonetheless. And so I guess we have to include campsites here as places, not just a Starbucks. Those folks can be partners working from a partner office. The net of it is they might not be within the confines of your organization on your network where you have specific controls. And in a public cloud environment, everybody's kind of an outsider, since you, at least from a network perspective. So that's a couple of the folks you want to talk about. But more recently, when you talk about virtualized infrastructure, whether that be a private cloud environment, a VMware environment, for example, or a public cloud environment, or even a SaaS environment, a software as a service type application environment, there's a new class of even what I would call uber super user that have even more privileges than most people. The VMware AWS administrator have access to a console, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, that lets them do some really, really cool things. But it also puts a whole lot of power in the hands of the individuals who have access to that console. They can reconfigure the network, etc. So we'll spend some time there and talking about that risk in specific. Something that doesn't always come up when you talk about this is the fact that you've got a set of applications that are privileged. And let me give you, and so very often privileged in that they have inside of those applications, either in the source code of those applications or sometimes in configuration files that those applications access, privileged passwords. A classic example is a holding company scenario where you've got a business that has to roll up, for example, the financials across a number of different sub-organizations. So each of the application or the script that actually pulls the data every month or every quarter to do the roll-up reporting very often will have a set of passwords in it to the different databases in the held companies, in the subsidiaries. They may be all the same. They may all be on an Oracle platform, for example, or maybe some Oracle, some DB2, some SQL Server, etc. But nonetheless, those applications or the configuration files that they access end up having privileged credentials in them. So not a privileged user per se, but certainly part of the risk fabric that you need to think about when you're talking through this topic. And The last two other kind of classes, and one is the over-privileged users. One of the things that we are very good at in most organizations is doling out privileges. Unfortunately, one of the things that we're not always so good at is taking them back when they should no longer. And so the obvious example is when an employee leaves the firm, or when a contractor is no longer working on contract, etc. So that's kind of the obvious case. But things that happen all the time. An employee is working on one project, has credentials to the set of infrastructure required for that project, moves on to a different project, and should no longer have those credentials. And very often our processes don't catch up with that all the time. In some cases, some organizations have very good processes, others don't. And then the last box here at the bottom with the hacker, the idea that privileged accounts are exactly the kind of accounts that a hacker, whatever flavor of attacker that is, would want to get a hold of, and they're using different tricks, different malware or other kinds of threat agents to grab, for example, privileged credentials. They'd much rather have a set of privileged credentials to the environment than get some end user password. They can do damage with both. They can do far more damage with a set of privileged credentials, or they can get further into your network, usually using those kind of credentials. So a hacker obviously isn't a privileged user, but if he steals the credentials of a valid privileged user, he can assume that role. So that really gives you the whole kind of impression of the folks that we're considering here. There's a good argument. Some folks would add to that. For example, a vice president or above at a financial institution who may have signature authority within an application, so there's some other legitimate questions or people that you might consider privileged users. The definition that we're talking about tends to be the systems network database administrators that are work for you directly or work for contractors. So that takes us to the okay. So we know who they are. Why should I care? Well, Snowden being the poster child gives you some inkling of this, but this is more than just a single incident or a single attack. There's a wall of names of folks who have had issues with privileged insiders, either doing damage, deleting a bunch of servers, for example, or stealing data or trade secrets, etc. And so, one of the things that we always look to is, what's going on in reality. The 2013 Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, which is a fantastic report. If you don't already read that on an annual basis, it's well worthwhile. What they do is take a look at actual breaches, not theoretical vulnerabilities and theory stuff. They're taking a look at specific breaches from all over the world, and really walking back through those breaches to try to figure out exactly what happened. Who did what? How did they do it? What was their motivation? And what tactics did they use to do that? And then they, based on that diligent analysis, they come up with some specific observations that help us understand, what we need to be doing in our environment, what kind of actual threats we need to be looking out for, and how we need to protect. And they provide some very specific recommendations. So what you see here in the bullet points on the left is some of the the vectors that people use. And in these attacks, many of these data breaches use more than one vector for a particular attack. So it's not just a one-size-fits-all kind of a scenario. In some cases, for example, they stole credentials, or they used backdoors and command control to get in. If you take a look at the recommendations in the report, we always kind of go to the end of the report. We like to read the ending very often, and you will see it very much laced with recommendations about making sure that you have your administrative or privilege account activity and privilege accounts locked down well. I mean, you can see in red here some of the different recommendations that were part of being able to solve or mitigate the kinds of attack vectors that are listed here. So, again, this is real world stuff. This is not theory stuff, and again, a very good source of information for things that you need to do, and they certainly hold the whole idea of checking administrative privileges or in really high regard here. The other why should I care reason is, frankly, is now because the auditors do. for a long time, this wasn't something that the auditors, quite candidly, were paying that much attention to. But I guess starting with WikiLeaks and then, in a big way with Snowden, but starting back in the WikiLeaks time frame, that was kind of the clarion call to an insider being able to do real damage to an organization. You started to see, two things. First of all, there was a set of new regulatory requirements, or the requirements that were out there were modified to make sure that organizations were taking this particular risk into account and doing the appropriate thing about it. And even those, and so some of the ones that are lit up in red here, under the FISMA Act, which applies to U.S. federal agencies, NIST recently released something called the 853, which is a set of controls for protecting systems, a very exhaustive list of controls for protecting systems that is really risk, by the way, risk-oriented. So it takes into account the relative importance of those systems to the organization and has you apply the appropriate controls based on those risk levels. Well, they came out with a revision number 4 very recently that had a whole lot to do with additional controls required to protect against this particular risk. Others have followed suit. So PCI and the data security standard has that laced within it. The NERC SIP requirements, the latest versions of those also have laced in it. But even those that have not been necessarily changed recently or amended, in those cases, the auditors are still looking, that you have this particular risk locked down. So even if there isn't a specific mandate for it, the auditors have really gotten savvy, to the true risk and what the threat looks like and what the vulnerabilities are, and are requiring organizations to put things in place. It was a really interesting Information Week article came out a day or two ago by Joel Masters, who did a really nice job characterizing some of the issues with regard to cloud security, and one of the specific things that he pointed out was privileged user access in cloud ends up being very important. It's an interesting article. That's not really the thrust of the article. The thrust of the article are what are all the things that you actually have to worry about in the cloud, and I think one of the summary statements is that. And this is coming from a CTO who's been doing cloud computing for his organization for quite some time. So very informed opinion and decisions on this. Really smart guy. His view was that listen, you can frankly be safer in the cloud. So it's worth a read just to get that perspective. And the biggest headache that most CIOs and CISOs face when they get over the giving up some of the level of control is what do they need to do to satisfy the auditors? Yes, what do you need to do to make your environment secure, make the cloud environment secure? And that can be a little tricky, but very manageable in his view. And then what do you really need to do to make the auditors? And what do the auditors need to do to to focus on the actual things that matter? So good article, well worth a read on this same topic. So how is that risk changing? Have the risks in this environment truly changed? And if you take a look at the threat, that is the folks who would like to do you harm, the threat actors are pretty much the same. There's a criminal element who would like to steal data, and again, this is depending on what kind of an organization, some of these people are more or less important. There are certainly folks who would like to embarrass or take down your network, denial of service, kinds of things to make political or other statements, and so those folks are still there. You've got insiders in your organization, although a small percentage of them, even if it's a 1% or 0.5%, it's still people that might want to either do you damage or use some of what they found for monetary gain, for example. So the threat actors in this environment really haven't changed. They're all the same kinds of people trying to do all the same kinds of things as in the past. I guess the only thing I neglected to mention in that list was state sponsors of terror, and they're all there. They haven't changed. What has changed is the way we're doing computing. So certainly virtualization in cloud computing has changed a lot of things, and there are a lot of organizations doing it for awesome business reasons. Whether it's cost reduction or the speed at which you can bring things to market, the agility which you have to turn things on, turn compute power on or turn network power on or off, is pretty interesting. And frankly, I think one of the things that we're seeing, from our customers who are doing a lot in the cloud is it gives organizations an opportunity to basically do brand new applications that they really couldn't do. Either they were too difficult to do on current infrastructure or prohibitively costly. One of the ones that comes up fairly often is kind of the big data analytics thing, and in the past you ended up had to buy a whole lot of iron, spend a whole lot on software implementations to get those environments up. Just to even, for example, do an experiment to see if some data analytics project would really pay an ROI. In the cloud environment, that's not the case. You can spin up some servers, do a test, and for tens of thousands of dollars, not millions or tens of millions of dollars, and really get somewhere. So all of those are business reasons. One of the things that makes these environments so interesting and so useful is the fact that it's really this new class of software-defined IT infrastructure. There's a huge amount of power in the fingertips of the folks who are implementing these through these management consoles, and you can use a software package to basically do what lots of people with feet and shoes and hands had to do in terms of racking servers and things like that took months and and weeks, or at a minimum, or months, now can be done with a couple of mouse clicks with these things. So it's really brought up a whole new operational model, and with this really extended and expanded management plane, you've got new security and risk compliance issues. So it's not that the threat changed, but our infrastructure is dramatically changed. And I'm not, it may seem for a second that I'm only focusing on virtualization and cloud, but many of the large organizations that we work with are doing a little of all of that, and mostly embracing some hybrid kind of environment. So they have a ton of stuff on their traditional infrastructure, has certainly virtualized very heavily their server infrastructure in most cases, and many of them there's really a continuum here. Some of them are doing a whole lot in the public cloud environment. Some of them just have a kind of a toe in the water and are still sorting it out. Some of them would say they're not really doing a lot, and then you ask the business units and find out that, well, there's lots of different SaaS applications and things like that all around the organization. So even organizations who would tell you that they're not doing that much very often are doing quite a bit in the cloud. So that really has changed the risk equation here most dramatically. And it looks a little bit, like this. I mean, this, so some of the issues that, and the operational challenges that come up are, we've talked about the extended management plane. It's basically a whole new risk surface area, and some of that surface area extends beyond traditional perimeter controls. It's not, no longer can you use a castle and moat, with firewalls at all the gates. And build yourself effectively a castle. A lot of that infrastructure, in a private cloud, it may live inside. In a public cloud environment or a SaaS environment, it certainly doesn't live in your four walls. In these environments where cloud becomes a part of it, there's a shared security model for this, and even a shared audit model. You can't walk into most cloud providers, backside and into their operation and do the scrutiny, but they're doing audits themselves in many cases. There are a lot of controls that some of the better cloud providers that have put in place, and arguably, as I think you'll see in that article, that the InfoWeek article, you can do as good or better in cloud security as you can on premise. People might, I think people will have some valid opinions on that, but that doesn't negate the fact that the organization, are still responsible for the security, and there's a lot of things that you have to do. For example, if you're using an infrastructure as a service kind of environment, there's still a lot of security that you have to build. They built some controls in their environment. You've got to build some controls into the environment that you host on top of their hypervisor, so to speak. An interesting twist is it also puts in place a on-demand procurement paradigm, which is fantastic. That's, as I need something, I can spin up new servers only as I need them. I can spin them down when I'm not using them. So whether that's each day or at holiday season for retailers or et cetera, that flexible environment's great. It also means that in some ways the systems, or the cloud administrators, if we want to call them that, end up having the the Visa card, the corporate Visa card, in their pocket or in their console. So in many cases, this bypasses the set of financial controls that a lot of organizations have in place. If I spin up lots of new servers or lots of new storage capacity, I can effectively start billing the organization right away going around. So that's an interesting paradigm shift for folks. There's a couple of other things here. We talked about the new mandates and auditor scrutiny, for these environments, and that article points out a lot of that. And just one of the challenges is that these environments are very dynamic, very elastic. They come, they go, et cetera, which provides all kinds of operational benefits and even security benefits. It shouldn't be lost on anybody doing security for a couple of decades that one of our biggest issues in these environments, one of our biggest issues in a traditional networking environment was that we didn't always know what was on our network. If somebody plugged in a wireless router, behind our firewalls and turned it on, a long time ago, those were very hard to discover. That's gotten better and easier now, but you still don't have basically perfect optics into the servers that people put on your network, et cetera. In a public cloud environment, you can't actually get to the network without going through the console. You can spin things up and spin things down, but that just means that your risk is moved and changed slightly. We are constantly scouring the universe and the environment for the different standards and trying to keep up with a lot of them. And with all that work that we do to try to stay really on top of what all the regulatory agencies are doing, et cetera, we every once in a while we stumble upon one. And fairly recently we stumbled upon something that's been out for 2 years. This was a 2011 document from NIST, which is the National Institutes of Standards and Technology for the U.S. federal government. Is their standard-setting body, and they have under the FISMA Act, they have the responsibility for developing security standards as one piece of their mandate. And this was a pretty interesting thing that kind of points to why should I care as well. This was in their Guide to Security for Full Virtualization Technology, and I think the top sentence there is really the clearing call. When you're talking about the security of virtual infrastructure, that really means that you have to be able to lock down the virtualization management system. So this idea of the extended management plane, is pervasive and certainly something that NIST picked up on. Interestingly, another one that we, that is newer is NIST has out a document called the Special Publication 500-299, which is their cloud security architecture. And very interestingly, they've got a specific section on security and risk management, but even more interestingly, they've got a dedicated section to privileged management infrastructure. They thought so highly of this as a risk that they captured that at the same level, if you will, of you can see threat and vulnerability management is also a section there. I know this is an eye chart for most folks. By the way, you can get the slide deck if you want it. We'd be happy to send this off to you, and we'll have the video of this, or the audio and video of this available after the webinar, like we usually do. But just to call out some of the things that are in this privileged management infrastructure section of their cloud security architecture. It talks about all the different kinds of things you need to be thinking about, from identity management, authentication, the privilege usage management, and it's quite a good list of capabilities. We've noted here in the slide that they actually map these different capabilities of privilege management infrastructure back to the controls that they've outlined in the special publication 853, which is the publication that again talks about all the controls that you should have in place to adequately secure your systems and data. So you can they've even got it color coded back to the the family of protection and kind of the section of that document, which is well worth reading if you haven't ever looked at it. Our friends over at Gartner have also weighed in on this pretty heavily, and the top part of the sentence is probably the most interesting piece for us. So they were in a recent report that Nick Nichols did, Gartner analyst, called the State of Identity and Access Management with regards to public and private cloud. He talked about the private cloud and IaaS environment gaining more concentrated power. Those administrators have very concentrated power because of those management consoles, and obviously there's a risk that goes with that. So they've certainly weighed in on this. So let me, before we jump to our best practices piece, wanted to just spend just a second on this whole idea of software-defined data centers. If anybody was at the VMworld conference last week, by the way, there was a whole slew of announcements and some forward-leaning statements from VMware that they've obviously got a management console in front of their hypervisor and their virtualization environment, but they're going there even further, as are any public cloud provider already has this. And the classic use case we've kind of pictured here, a systems administrator or a database or a cloud administrator, if we want to call them that. I don't think that term is really caught on, but somebody who can configure the network and the infrastructure for your cloud environment. Now, the classic use case is somebody sitting behind typically a web-based console and has access to things to spin up servers or spin down servers or allocate storage or configure networks. And so that is one use case that we see in all of our large clients. But that's being in many large or more experienced enterprises that are have done more with the cloud for a longer period of time. That's really being eclipsed by kind of a new method of interfacing with these with the cloud environment and configuring it. Many of these cloud or virtualization platforms are fronted by a set of pretty well documented management APIs. In fact, that's what the web-based management console talks to. Very often they're the console's calling the API to have it do work, but these organizations are exposing those APIs as well. So through a command line interfacing you can do right from the command line, or commands that you can wrap in a script like Python or Perl or PHP are two classic cases. And we're starting to see a whole lot in this whole idea of DevOps, the idea of more tightly integrating development and operations, so you're not just instantiating servers and an environment or a platform, you're instantiating the application and the platform all in one sloop with some pretty powerful tools like Puppet or Chef are two of the more notable ones. Some of the cloud providers have their own if you will, recipe tools, which are effectively automation tools, and those things all talk to the management APIs. So to some extent, instead of an administrator, with heads, hand, and fingers going to a console and setting up a new environment or changing the environment, they can also do that by writing a script. So that's a new threat vector that a lot of folks really haven't thought about. In speaking with the folks over at Securiosis the other day, Rich Mogul, who's been working in this for a while, I think it was even 2 years ago back at Black Hat, did some pretty interesting, it wrote up some really interesting scripts to show how this could have an impact in environments, to demonstrate it. They're the Securiosis folks are the team that actually does the training at the Cloud Security Institute, and they're really revamping their coursework to make sure that that they cover this particular risk. And he was pretty shocked at how few of the CISOs in the large enterprises that they talk with were really even aware of this threat vector. Or this vulnerability, actually more aptly stated. I mean, it's a threat in that an administrator has to write a script, but it's a it's a potential vulnerability area that really needs to get managed. And there's a couple of key issues. Very often the credentials to these management APIs, people will share them because that's easy. It's very difficult to attribute the privilege activity to a unique user. Who wrote the script that fired up 50 servers, or pulled data or copied off 100 other servers, etc. Ends up being sometimes a hard question to ask unless you really thought through this. And very often, it's certainly in the public cloud environment, very often there's not a lot on the logging side from the vendor about what happened. Some of that's changing now, but even those the new logging that's available tends to be time delayed, so you don't get real-time understanding of who may have changed the environment and what exactly they did. So again, a risk. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute about how to protect against that. So that leads us to our top 10 list. Hopefully that by this point, everybody along understands that it's probably pretty important to protect the most privileged accounts and watch out for the users that have the most power in an environment. That's become increasingly a little bit more complex in a cloud environment or a hybrid environment, and something to to think about. So here's our, without trumpets or fanfare, here's our top 10 list, kind of split into two sections. So first of all, this first thing is really all about what the things that the customer has to do by themselves with process. There's some technology supporting this, workflow and things like that, but most often this is pen and paper kind of work. And it's making sure that you've done background checks on the people that are going to get credentials, and each one of these bullet points on this first point about creating a process for on and offboarding privileged users, and I would actually add to that changing privileges when they change roles or functions, as we talked about overprivileged users earlier. In each one of these scenarios, you got to think not just my employees, but also other folks that are going to be touching my infrastructure. They may be managed service providers, consultants, et cetera. So these bullets apply all the way across. So background checks is one piece of the puzzle. Making sure that you have policies in place, and that folks who come on board know what those policies are, and that you've got some periodic review of who's entitled to do what in the environment, who has access and what they're allowed to do. The second is really this concept of least privilege, and if anywhere it applies for privilege or sysadmin types accounts and these cloud console accounts, it's very important for these. So when we say least privilege, we mean least everything. Least only having access to the devices or nodes that they should have access to based on responsibility, only having the methods to get to those devices that they should based on their job role, whether it's console connect, a command line interface, or something like FTP, and hopefully very rare scenarios, and that they're only allowed to execute the commands that they should, or that you're allowed to, or that you can set it up so that they can't do certain commands if that's not within their, certain important commands, for example, like dropping the table in a database, or rebooting a server, unless that's unless they should have that privilege, rather than just a wide open set of commands that they can run. Strong authentication is a critically important piece of this. At a minimum, strengthening the user ID and password mechanism that you have in place. Stronger passwords, are important. But everybody knows the backstory to that by now. The problem with really strong passwords is, what do people do? They write them down. They put them on yellow sticky notes. They put them in a spreadsheet, and then email that spreadsheet around to the other sysadmins, et cetera. So, this is one problem that can beget another. So the second bullet there is, talking about implementing multi-factor authentication. So things like smart cards, for example, are becoming, pretty well used in the federal government, and actually, a lot of our financial services customers are looking at that. But even if it's, multi-factors, there's all kinds of things from, phone factor kinds of solutions to, that you get off of your cell phone, basically one-time tokens, all kinds of ways that you can implement multi-factor authentication. Another thing we think is particularly important is separating the authentication process, the do I know who you are and are you authorized to get somewhere, to what you're actually allowed to do. The separating authentication from authorization. And a lot of folks in the past, to take care of this privilege management issue, have tried to do things like use jump boxes and that sort of thing, or firewall rules and ACLs, and very often that landed people at inside the door, so you could auth and make sure that they were the right people, but from there they often could get to just about any other device and do whatever they wanted. So once I was on the network, I was able to get in and do what I wanted. So protecting privileged account credentials, whether those credentials happen to be stored in a in software or config file was one of the use cases that we talked about, or just protecting them. It better than writing them down or putting them in a spreadsheet. Getting them into a credential safe that can protect them and is appropriately um, uh, you know appropriately managed, ends up being important, and that also really reduces an administrative burden. Most organizations have password management rules that require you to change those on a periodic basis. That can be prohibitively, costly to do, especially with the application kinds of passwords. So having a vaulting and management capability ends up being pretty important. And on to our next 5. A big thing is making sure that however you set that up, that all the activity is logged. That you can't be anonymous. For example, multiple people aren't sharing the same passwords or the same credentials, so that when you go to ask a question or the auditor asks a question, who was root at 2 o'clock on Tuesday, you're giving an answer like Bill or Sally, not IP address 196.45.22, etc. So being able to tie the person to the specific activity that happened, even if you're using shared accounts on the back end, ends up being important. A lot of folks set up their infrastructure using a single account on each of the servers, for example, for just the ease of setting that up. So we totally get that, but you got to be able to tie who did what at what point, or your auditors, frankly, aren't going to be happy. Obviously, for the management consoles that we talked about, hopefully we made a pretty good case for being able to provide extra protection for that highly concentrated power that you're now seeing in this whole software-defined data center movement with both public and private cloud environments. Ends up being really important. Being able to, so most of what we've talked about is kind of proactive controls, but the reality is stuff is going to happen. So, making sure that if somebody tries to do something that they're not supposed to do, that you can alert on those violations, get that into your, SIM environment, your log management system, is important, so you can make sure the right people who can do something about it are there, or being able to automatically lock out an account or terminate a session for somebody who's made a violation of policy ends up being important. And a corollary to that is being able to really log and record everything. You don't, the idea of the the two-man rule, the NSA rule that we talked about earlier, is probably more than most organizations would be able to swallow, but being able to go back and know exactly what privileged users do when they're in a session, when they did it, who did it, what, maybe not why, but what exactly was done, ends up being really important for forensics. And the last one here is mining this, what I call mining the API gap. A lot of people aren't thinking about that yet, but it's not just locking down the management console. In many ways, it's making sure that you have a way to protect the programmatic use of the management infrastructure for virtualization consoles that is getting done. Anybody who's doing virtualization at any real scale or cloud at any scale is either looking into or doing this already. Using the APIs and using the DevOps tools, or using scripting capability to work with those APIs. And that's not tremendously different than what we saw sysadmins do 5, 10, 15 years ago. They wrote a lot of scripts to automate things. The difference was that those scripts typically had log on to a single server or to a single tool. They didn't have access to the entire virtualized or cloud infrastructure. So it's really a it's a magnitude issue, not exactly perfectly new to folks who've been with security for a while, but definitely a new risk area to take a look at. So that's a pretty tall order for organizations, a lot of things to think about, and we've thought pretty heavily over the last bunch of years and have moved precipitously. And anybody who's followed Xceedium knows that we've done a lot to protect traditional environments, and we'll talk about that, but we've done a lot as of late to be able to roll that kind of capability out over virtualized, public and private cloud environments. And that's really pushed us, and hopefully we'll push some of the other vendors in the space, to do some things that that weren't done before. And we kind of categorize this into kind of a top 3 list of what you need to be a true next generation kind of privileged identity management platform. First of all, you need a comprehensive integrated control set. You're not going to want 3 or 4 or 5 different point products to implement each of these different sets of controls. It's just, first of all, you'd never be able to get the information in any, without spending lots and lots of time, money, and effort, back to an auditor about what policies you've implemented and how they've been implemented, and et cetera. But it's just so there's the administrative burden, to it, that's one piece, and a very important piece. But you also end up then, if you have multiple different point products, you just have gaps. You have gaps in things that you've covered, and it's hard to compare a policy from one tool to another. So a tool that can truly integrate all these set of controls that you need into one environment under one policy management engine ends up being really important. And you got to be able to protect everything, whether those are traditional Unix systems running in a data center, mainframes, AS400s, or Unix or Windows systems running up on your virtualized or your public cloud environment. You've got to be able to protect the stuff across a hybrid cloud environment, not just in a traditional data center. And number 3 is really easy to say, but frankly a little bit harder to describe. But there's a lot of, there's some folks that are, posing out there, candidly. And if you're not architected, and we've been at this for a couple of years, and one of the things that we learned, pretty quickly is if you're not architected for this dynamic environment, if you don't make specific architectural changes to a product, last generation PIM products just aren't going to work. I'll give you 2 concrete examples. One is, think about a cloud environment where I can spin up 1,000 servers, getting ready for the web servers, for example, getting ready for the holiday, traffic that retailers are getting ready to, contend with over the next few months. If the next sentence was, the security team saying, well, give us a little while, a couple of weeks, and we'll get all the the configuration information and all the policies set up for those devices, that just isn't going to fly anymore. The answer is you've got to be able to auto-discover that those things got spun up. The tool's going to have to figure that out. That's not the hard part. The hard part is making sure that you automatically apply a set of policies to those different servers that you spun up right away, so that they don't go anytime without protection, or it doesn't take an army of people to get it all set up. And more importantly to the business, it doesn't take a long time. So that's one concrete example of being architected for the cloud. Another one is just frankly dealing with these cloud management APIs. If you haven't got a way to proxy those connections, for example, and make sure that you can authenticate what script and who it belongs to, and whether it's has privileges to do the commands that it wants to do. If you don't have those kinds of things, embedded in your tool, again, you're just posing. So we spent a lot of time, on those over the last couple of years, and again, we would expect some other vendors, to start catching up there. So with that, our solution is something we call Xsuite. We believe it is the only real next generation privileged identity management, platform that meets all the criteria that we talked about. First of all, it definitely covers the hybrid cloud, so we have support for mainframe and AS400s. We support the the Windows environment, Linux, Unix, a whole host of networking devices that are in traditional data center. That's where we started life. It's something that we do well, and what we've done is expand those set of controls that we can run there across all these other environments. So VMware environments, for vSphere, Amazon. AWS environment, and most recently extended the set of controls to the Office 365 admin console. You'll note on the virtualized data center and AWS public cloud, we've got listed both the infrastructure and the management consoles, and that "and" is very important. You've got to be able to protect host systems or guest systems running up on that environment. So root account on a Unix server that may be running up there. And you've also got to protect access to the console which means both the web-based console and the APIs that surround that. So it's a lot of real estate to cover from a risk perspective and from a protection perspective, and we think we're the only one out there doing that. And the bottom part of the list is, the idea of controlling and auditing all privilege access wherever it comes from and whatever it's getting to under a single unified policy management system. Gives you both the optics into your policies. It's administratively easy to do that way, and lastly, it provides a way for you to prove pretty quickly to an auditor that you've got that environment locked down. The important point to make, with the last part of this diagram is we've given customers the choice. They can buy different flavors of Xsuite. They can buy it in a hardware appliance that they rack and stack in their own data center, or they can get two virtual appliance flavors, one in an OVF format that runs up on VMware environments, or one that will run up in the Amazon management or Amazon EC2 environment. That's the AMI version. It's important to note that any one of those form factors can manage, can do all of the functions that we've got listed there across all of those environments. So if you choose to manage your whole environment from a virtual appliance running up on Amazon, you can do that. Of course, you have to have network connectivity back to your data center, so there's some caveats to that, or there's at least some things that you need to do, but that's absolutely possible in our environment. And the same thing, if you want to run or manage all of your cloud and virtualized infrastructure from a hardware appliance, you can do that as well across all of these environments. So something that we've done a lot of thinking about to make this architecture work in a truly hybrid next generation kind of enterprise. I think we hit most of these. These don't line up one for one in terms of the best practices that you need to do, but here are the core capabilities that are in Xsuite. From role-based privilege access and vaulting, managing credentials. I say passwords here, and sometimes we use those interchangeably, but it's not just passwords anymore. A lot of the way people access devices, for example, up in the cloud environment, is they're providing an X5 or 9 cert. Which happens to be like a very complicated password, so to speak. So vaulting and managing those and rolling those ends up being important as well. Something we didn't spend a lot of time on, for example, was being able to do identity, bridging. A lot of folks have spent a lot of money on their, AD or LDAP environment, setting that up and being able to use, authentication and role definitions that are already built into your environment in those directories, and broker use that and broker across to let you into and give you the appropriate responsibilities, or limit you to the appropriate responsibilities in a cloud or virtualization environment, ends up being important as well. So what we think sets us apart is that we believe we're the only guys out there with a comprehensive set of well-integrated controls that really work all the way across a hybrid cloud environment. We spent a lot of time making sure that there's a single point of policy enforcement. By the way, anybody who hears that never did operations would say, wait a minute, if it's a single point, that's also a single point of failure. Very true. So something that's built directly into our platform is the ability to cluster. So we've got active clustering built into our platform. It's not something that you have to buy extra software or software for. If you, of course, if you buy a hardware appliance and want to cluster 2 hardware boxes, you've bought a second appliance. But the software is all built in and ready to go in the Xsuite environment. Unified policy management is one of those things that's almost, it's the shortest statement up there, but candidly, probably one of the most important things. Being able to go into one single policy management interface and know exactly how everything is set up ends up being important, rather than diving in and out of multiple different modules. We've actually had clients come back to us who had made other decisions with other vendors, felt the heat because it was just unmanageable, and have switched for exactly that reason. Protecting both the management consoles and the guest systems running on a virtualized or cloud environment is important. Being able to integrate with the big guys, out there. Anybody who's got other environments, that some of the secondary or tertiary, cloud environments, would stay tuned. We've we've bitten off and done deep integration with all the major platforms out there. We're not stopping here. We'll continue to move forward. The API calls, being able to use a proxy, put a proxy in place to make sure that only the appropriate API calls get made to those cloud and virtualization platforms ends up being important. It's something that's built in, something that's a capability of X Suite. And we talked about being architected specifically for the cloud, and I gave a couple of examples there. I think more than that, the last two bullets are really important to our enterprise customers. We've been at this for a while. We've always sold to large enterprises. We've got some of the largest implementations for privileged identity management in the world, and so having built-in clustering or high performance options so that these things can reliably scale ends up being super important. Especially since you're putting all your important credentials, all your management capability, in through or running it through a single platform. Hey, that thing better work. It better scale. And the last piece is we're very highly certified. It's not the lion's share of our business, but we do a very healthy business with the U.S. federal government, and in doing so, we end up having to meet some pretty high bars there. We've common criteria, FIPS certified. We are the only privileged identity management platform that is on the Unified Command, the DISA, which is for our DoD organizations, the DISA list, which is the Unified Command Approved Products list. So we spent a lot of time and frankly a lot of money making sure that we have that kind of nailed down. So that's all I had for this, part of this of the discussion. We've still got some time. I'd love to. Looks like we've got a dearth of questions, so hopefully we'll get some questions in there. And again, like I said in the beginning, if some folks want to point out anything that I might have missed that you see as a best practice in your environment, we'd be happy to kind of relay that to the crowd as well. As you can see on this slide, there's whole lots of different ways to get in touch with us. Certainly the website. Many of the topics, by the way, that we covered in some of these individual slides, if you go to our blog, the Xceedium blog, you'll likely find any one of those specific topics covered, whether it's API stuff or whether it's what does it take to be a next generation product, etc. So I would definitely probably should have that listed up here, and we don't. But it's at www.xceedium.com/blog. Is the easy way to get to it. So, quick question. I got one on pricing. How do we license X Suite? Great question. So the licensing model, we license in one of two different ways. With the hardware appliance and the VMware virtualized appliance, it's a traditional perpetual license. So you buy the appliance. Which comes, as we said, with all of the software stack. It's everything from operating system all the way up through anything that you need from a software perspective, to deploy X Suite. And then we charge based on the number of managed or secured nodes. So all the different servers that you have out in the environment, we charge for each one of those. So that's the basic model for those two form factors. And for AWS, we actually do kind of a subscription. It's really a term license that we do. So it's we license it by we use a similar pricing model, but instead of paying maintenance separately, we bundle the maintenance and the licensing together into a term license, an annual term license. So again, two different models that we have there to do that. All right, so I got another question here. Can we make this presentation available for download? Absolutely. So we'll do two things. I'll go ahead and make sure that we get the PDF of this up. I'll probably pop it up on our blog or something. So stay tuned for that. We're going to be sending out an email to everybody who attended, or even the folks who missed the presentation, with a link to the recorded copy of this. We record all these so that folks who couldn't be with us can listen to them, or folks that would like to get back to them can. So we'll be happy to make you should be looking for that probably early next week. We'll get that back out to you. So the next one is, can Xceedium detect and prevent when a user is entering Windows command line? So Not so. It's not a. Actually, that's a great question in multiple ways because it gives me an opportunity to highlight kind of the architecture. So, um, if an individual it's not something that you would use to lock down the Windows command line from an individual user. There's lots of ways you can do that right within the Microsoft fabric. What it does is lock down, and by the way, very arguably you could call that privilege, a privilege account function. If I can get to the command line and install software and do those kinds of things as an end user. What it does is it works like a proxy. So, and I say like a proxy, it's not exactly always a proxy in perfect definition there. But to give you a mind's eye of how it works is an end user, so a sysadmin, for example, would log on to Xsuite. They would be presented with a web. They log on through the web. They present with a web page that shows them all of the specific devices that they're explicitly authorized to access and the access methods. So RDP, for example, in a Windows environment. And then they click that. They click the link to that, and Xsuite grabs the credential for that particular resource from the safe, passes it on the back end to the target system, and then makes the connection. And if the policy is set up this way, records the full session. If the policy is set up this way, it can block certain commands, from being executed, etc. Since we sit in line in the network, we can do all kinds of fun things, before those commands ever actually hit the end box. But it's not necessarily for an end business user, for example. Are you releasing a storage unit for the Xsuite appliance? Very good question, and I'm going to have to look at it. It comes with storage. You can also, for the log traffic, we have two. We can support multiple different interfaces and two at a time, so we can siphon off all the log traffic to outside storage. I think this refers to probably SAN and that sort of stuff. And let me do this. I'll get an answer out to everybody on that question, because I'll have to check with our product management team in terms of what they're going to be supporting moving forward. So some good questions. Anybody have any comments about other things that we missed in terms of best practices for privileged users? Love to hear those too. And by the way, if you don't want to do it here and you just want to send us an email at info@xceedium.com, that'd be great too. Love to hear your feedback and get your input as well. I think it looks like we've hit most of the questions here. I've got one to follow up on, but I thank you all for attending today. We had a great audience from all over the place, and thanks for hanging in there with us. As we said, we'll get this presentation wrapped up and the recording back out to you. So have a fantastic weekend, and we look forward to seeing you on the our next webinar. Take care. Have a wonderful day.